Let me introduce our keynote speaker, David Hussman. He's going to give us a little discussion about how to build the wrong thing faster and learn from it. Thank you.
I never ever get like 90 minutes to talk, so I always end up sort of just rushing right into things and not introducing myself. And I thought, I never say thanks for being someplace. So here's 5 reasons why I'm thankful to be in Portland. Number 1, I live in Minneapolis, and I was going to say I hope Minneapolis grows up to be Portland, but I guess it's bigger than Portland. So I hope Minneapolis evolves towards Portland. So I feel like, if Minneapolis is an 8 on the weird scale, Portland's an 11. So I'm trying to turn that up in Minneapolis. Number 2, I call my look business camping. If they don't sell it at REI, I don't buy it, right? So I'm sure the Gap's going to pick up on that any day now. Number 3, my oldest daughter went to Lewis and Clark and had an awesome experience. And number 4, now she plays in the Portland Cello Project. I mean, yeah. She just toured through Minneapolis, and I got to go see my 23-year-old sit up on stage with 4 other cellists and play everything from, I don't know, like much pop music, but they played like a Pantera song, and then they played a Bach piece, and then they played a piece by a cellist out here that does a lot of compositions. And how cool is this city to produce a cello project, of cellists touring the world? And sort of the last one is somewhere in 1999, 2000, I was a tech lead on a project team, trying to help my team do well. Pretty serious geek at that point in my life. And I read this white paper from some people at Tektronix. And I thought, wow, they're talking about doing things differently. And I was getting pretty frustrated about a lot of the people I worked with. What I didn't realize then that I sort of realize now is I had a lot of programmer friends that would just tell everyone things were done. So one of my buddies is a CTO, and people come in his office, he says, are you done? They say yes. He says, what's left? And everybody answers. Another one of my friends sent me a picture of these Dutch firefighters kneeling in front of this building they had just put out, and they were kind of standing there as a firefighting group, all proud that they had put out the building. While they were taking the picture, the building started on fire again. And I was on too many projects like that in the 90s. I didn't really feel like we had control of things, and when I read this paper, I thought, okay, these are people that are calling out the software developers that are lying about testing, as an example. And I'm not trying to suck up to you guys. Like, I wrote C++ in the 90s, and it was sort of a social norm to lie to your friends. And the lies sort of went like this. Hey, did you test that? Like, oh yeah, dude, I tested that. And we looked right at each other, and we lied about it. It was amazing until I started doing project work for Medtronic. And then it turns out you can't lie about testing when you're building a medical device. And then what I discovered then that's popular now is when you have to test, automation is not an extra task. And that's sort of a little bit of my journey. This is my shop. So yeah, we have a Fender Rhodes and some guitars, and we have these funny Marshall. These are our refrigerators. The only refrigerators that go to 11. One of the things I do when I'm hiring people is one of the first questions is, are you passionate about automation? Are you passionate about testing? Because I don't really want anybody that's in my crew that thinks that's someone else's job. Because everybody needs to be able to do it. That's not necessarily a new idea. It is hard to find a lot of people still that feel that way. I feel like we should call out most of the universities that do not teach testing to people that take engineering classes and programming classes. That's almost absurd, if not obscene, sort of at this point. So a little bit, maybe too much setup. Here's how I want to frame the discussion for today. A couple of books. Book on the left. Anybody read Founders at Work? Pretty interesting book, series of interviews. Great interview with Steve Wozniak, like classic Steve Wozniak. Figured out how to put color in because he ran out of chips. But dude was doing all this real-time design. The theme of this book that I think is interesting is almost every one of these groups pretty much says what we started out doing is not what we ended up doing. There was a significant change. It's not really a news story. It's also nice because it's a series of interviews. And I think the theme in the book is these people are pretty certain they shouldn't be certain. The other end of the spectrum is this book, written by a person who wrote Crossing the Chasm, famously. And the book, I think, is a nice metaphor because it talks about how great ideas don't reach orbit at larger companies because they can't get off the planet, they can't escape. And for all sorts of reasons, not anything that like people are evil. A lot of people I hear a lot of people say, oh, that person's really resistant. You know, I don't meet a lot of people that show up that are just inherently mean, that want to do bad things to other people. Most people I meet are maybe not testing or doing good work that way because they're scared. There's not enough time. There's some latent fear that drives them. But there are organizational weights. And I guess I want to sort of change the discussion today, because when I read that white paper written by the people at Tektronix, it was a new way of thinking. That was 15 years ago. That was sort of right about the same time when the unified process was about 10 or 15 years old. And I sort of feel like it's time for us to evolve. It's time for us to start changing our discussion a little bit. So I'm famous for cooking up weird ideas like this. It's because my oldest daughter, once I found out her friends all called me the Big Lebowski behind my back. At the same time, I went to a really great conference, and I heard someone talking about testing. In fact, it was a Nobel laureate. There's a university just south of Minneapolis called Augsburg, and they have a relationship with the Nobel family. So it was 2005, the 100th anniversary of Einstein's publications, and this brilliant physicist was talking. She went through gave this excellent talk, and at the end of the talk, one of the other physicists said, how do you know how the universe started? You weren't there. Then they started having one of those physicist arguments. But her whole argument was based on hypothesize, experiment, examine the results. At one point she said, I think you should remember that gravity is a theory. It's a well-tested theory, so if you jump off the building, the results are mostly known. But it was really great listening to this brilliant woman talk about the fact that it's a theory, and I thought, scientists don't argue about certain things, so scientists don't argue about this. Do you guys know what this is? Who in the room knows what that is, that equation? Ohm's law. Scientists don't have conferences or meetings about Ohm's law. It just sort of is. It's a simple equation which says if voltage remains constant and resistance goes to the floor, current goes through the roof. The average person calls that a short circuit. So Dude's law says that value is equal to y divided by how. Because lots of people want to know, how do you do story points? How do you write? How do you do planning games? How do you do Fibonacci planning? Blah, blah, blah. And they sort of forget why they're doing it. And I've taught a lot, adjunct faculty at universities, and when people are learning, they need to focus on this. But across time, the mechanics sort of need to be secondary to the process. And I sort of think that's what was going on in that white paper, is people were saying the process we're using isn't actually helping us discover what we don't know. It's not only is it not helping us deliver, but we're following in a process. And it's time for us to kind of start saying, we got a lot of process. I don't think we need more process. I think we need to start using that process and figure out what we're trying to accomplish. Now, just to geek out for a second, one of my buddies told me right away that in my equation, how couldn't equal 0. I said, in my equation, when how equals 0, you get infinite value. Which led me to this joke. So this is another one of my ideas, non-bond. It's the world's leanest process. Doesn't even have a website. Forget an infographic, doesn't have a website. It came from a discussion of a friend of mine in Mumbai, because I was frustrated with people adding more process. 2 years ago, I read a book called Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. And Taleb was talking about sustainable dynamic ecosystems that are anti-fragile are inherently subtractionist. You take things away. And what I see most times at companies is when people get frustrated with their process networking, they add more process to it. So non-bonds, the least amount of process with the most measurable value, or more simply put, I asked my friend in Mumbai, I said, would you ever serve a meal that's only naan bread? And he said, no. And I said, would you ever serve a meal without naan bread? And he said, no. I thought, there it is, right? It's just part of the meal. So some of my weird ideas, Dude's law, non-bond. Today I want to discuss the story of it. So I don't know, I bet you've all been involved in the discussion of it. And this story of it starts in California. Since you're recording this, I have to be sort of careful. But it's a big fancy company with big fancy executives. I'm the agile guy. Right? That's always the term I hate. Like, you're the agile guy. This dude strolls in and says, hey, you're the agile guy, right? I'm like, uh-oh. Just paint a target on me. The next question is it going to be done on time? And the person asked me that question, and that question is just filled with a dangerous amount of certainty. In that person's defense, it's sort of the only question we've given them to ask. We've forced people into sort of a dichotomous, this thing will be done or it won't be done. We're not sort of switching the game. And I think I looked at him being the consultant in the asbestos suit and said, he can fire him if he wants to. And I said, based on everything I've learned in the last few weeks, every answer anyone has given you is wrong. So I'm not going to answer that because I don't think we have enough evidence. I can't tell you when it will be done. I can tell you what is done. And once you have that, then you can start switching from budgeting to investing. As an example, if we say we're 60% of 100% done, but we don't have anything measurable that we can put in front of someone and validate, the more powerful shift that's more interesting than agile versus waterfall is, I'm 100% done with 10%. Then you could say, what should we do with another 90%? A brilliant executive I worked with at a company that has super ginormous budgets switched their funding model to say, you want 20 million for your project? I'll give you 5 million. At the end of the 5 million, you show me 100% and 25% of the value that you promised me. I'll give you the other amount. What happened when he did that is 50% of the suggested projects went away. Because sort of like a test-driven model, no one could really quantify how they would show 100% and 25%. And I think that's sort of the discussion we need to start having. We're deep in dialogues about budgets with a certain amount of certainty. If we spend the money, all is good, instead of thinking more from an investment perspective. So here's the exec. Is it done? When will it be done? And so he got me thinking, because I end up still comparing waterfall and agile. And I think that's a mistake. Has anybody ever read Winston Royce's paper, the waterfall paper? So someone has a couple people have. First page is a picture that has a little graph of the waterfall. First of all, what's interesting is Craig Larman went and interviewed his son, and his son said, my dad spent his life saying, that's not what I meant. The first graph on the first page says something like an ideal way to do software development. The second graph shows the same waterfall with feedback loops through the steps, which basically says, this is probably more realistic. Because he went out and did research in the 80s, and that's how things were happening. And instead of thinking about like agile versus waterfall, I've been trying to kind of frame it to people like this, because that discussion is still out there. It might not be out there on the people that are in trenches that are saying, look, agile is as interesting as objects. It's just a set of tools we should be using. But a lot of the people that are asking, is it going to be done? They don't feel that way. So I would say to them, we promised you a long time ago that if we did analysis and design and we really understood the problem, then we just had to build it. This is the world's worst estimate right there. People say it when they're frustrated. You just have to rebuild that, right? You just have to port it to a new technology. And what's interesting, back to what I was saying before, is at this point you have 50% of 100%. You're banking on the fact that you totally understand it. So let's make an argument. Let's say your cycle time here for your whole project being done is 6 months, 12 months, something more than a couple weeks. And your analysis is 100% perfect. Your design will absolutely solve all those analysis problems. Has anybody ever been on that project? Okay, who's been in the 90% zone? 80%? Yeah, it's like in the medical device world, in my experience, it's a more known universe. The retail world is not a known universe. It's a dynamic universe. The farther out you plan, the more likely things are to change. So it doesn't matter necessarily how right it is, which challenges us to not answer that guy's question. When will it be done? I would argue the bigger time is, the more likely, because that guy over here, he or she is saying, if I invest this, I get this back. And what happens is, somewhere along the way, where you need to go moves. And so the bigger time is, the longer time is, unless you're in an amazingly static ecosystem, the more likely it doesn't matter if the first part of your plan is right or wrong. So sort of my experience in this agile space was saying, well, let's shrink this down. And I call this like a discovery window. It's not unique language. That became wildly uncomfortable for people. We shrunk that down so that we didn't know enough. People would say, it's too short, we're not ready. And I understand that question. It's a good question for all of us to think about. How much time do you need to be ready? Now, what happened here that I thought was cool is that we went from a metaphor of estimation to size. That has sort of been lost. I still meet people that are like, we got to get good at estimating. But you can't get good at estimating something you've never done before. That's like a fool's folly. That's the nature of unknown. You have to kind of hypothesize, experiment, measure, and try and learn across time. If what you're doing is always changing, in the terms of like the extreme programming people, yesterday's weather doesn't matter. Because your evidence is only interesting if the future's like the past. If you're in a wildly dynamic ecosystem, you can't necessarily, that data doesn't help you. But I felt like the sizing stuff that was done right was trying to switch the story from how big, when will it be done, to that's too big. It's unwieldy. It's too large of an experiment. Too many things are going to change. Now, you still hope that over here you started with this and over here you ended up with this, and you still were driving towards something. You were just getting there a little differently. So you do a little bit of work, and now you have 100% of 8% or something. And now you have 100% of 16%, and the money moves. Where you need to go as an organization, as a product company, as a system, changed. What's a more interesting measure of agility is what stops you from going to where you need to go. And it might not be an agile practice that's in a book somewhere. Certainly, if you don't have a lot of automation, you can't do that because it's a lot of effort to try and switch direction without being scared. And so that discussion got me thinking that, what if I looked back at our time and I think, here's the 90s, here's 2000s, here's 2010. I think this was the land of project. We just got to get the project done. And we were overly certain. If you're on time, on budget, all would be well. And things started changing, and I think the 2000, that paper I'm talking about for me, ushered in the era of less certainty. I'm not sure that's right, but it was more, we spent a lot of time, I spent a lot of time and listened to a lot of people in 2000s talk about process. And I think we fixed a lot of things. Not everything, but we have much better tools. Now I think we need to kind of move into the decade of product. And we need to be not overly certain, not less certain, but wildly uncertain. We need to validate, we need to assume that most of what we're doing is wrong. And that's not how people think. This came up for me a couple years ago. I was on this team. They kept telling me, we got 68 points done in this sprint. And I thought, that's such a weird number. That's like, we went 55 miles. My email signature says, if you don't know where you're going, it's easy to iteratively not get there. And so I said to them, oh, you got 65 points done. How many were wrong? And they looked at me like, no, we got 65 points done. I was like, yeah, that's not the question I asked. How wrong were you? And I thought, we're not really thinking this way because we've been so steeped sort of in a discussion of product. So if we sort of riff on it in geek language, I would say, anybody read this book? This is interesting, so I apologize that many of the authors I read are also musos. This guy is a former music producer who's now a neuroscientist. And one of the things that's really interesting in the book is he talks about like how we organize our world. It seems really, really simple, but I would argue that in this decade, we are organized around, are you doing the process right? And maybe along with process, there was a discussion of progress. Are we getting somewhere? Because we didn't get very far over here. We weren't measuring things. This was the land of 60%, 100%. This was a switch to 100% at 10%. Now we have to kind of say, so what if we're getting somewhere? Are we going to the right place? And Levitin does a really nice job walking through and talking about how we structure the world. It's a little bit like George Lakoff, metaphors we live by, but I think it's time for us to sort of switch our metaphor to something different. And so this is my suggestion for how we can switch things. And this is agile heresy, certainly, in a lot of companies. And if it works for you, feel free to not switch it. But I go into a lot of places right now and someone says, I'm the Scrum Master. And my next question is, what do you do every day? I have no idea what that means anymore. It's not necessarily a right or wrong thing. It's just, for a long time, a lot of people would say, I'm a business analyst. And I would say, what do you do every day? Because a lot of the business analysts I knew were also some of the best testers because they had the most context. And then they got blamed for not having the requirements done on time because they were busy testing things. And we weren't disseminating that knowledge. And this is a term that we're using right now that I think is scary. We're selling dude who's asking us when it will be done, agile transformations. Sat at a table with a group 2 years ago. The guy said, We're on our third agile transformation. It was like, you started out as a caterpillar, then you became a butterfly, and now you're a three-eyed toad. You know? The guy that's paying for it, it person, is like, so we're all transformed, right? That's the metaphor we're sort of serving up. I think it's dangerous. I think that it has a serious amount of certainty to it. Maybe adoption isn't much better, but like adoption is like the beginning of the journey. So this is the more interesting shift I'd like to explore today. I like this. It's kind of Agile Manifesto-y like it's not that I don't care about this. I just feel like when this gets happening, when people become better at getting things done, inevitably what they start doing is questioning, are we doing the right thing? It's a higher order of quality. It's a higher order of testing. It's much more uncertain. It's not as easy to automate in a test. It's a little bit more of a challenge for us. So I would ask you guys to just turn to the person next to you. I always think it's funny to think about the Zune. You can tell how old people are when they laugh at the Zune. But you got to appreciate, and I might have these times a little bit wrong, but kind of somewhere from like 98 to 2004, Microsoft released the Zune and Vista, while Apple released the iPod and OS X. I mean, how is Vista not the Lord Voldemort of operating systems? You know, I mean, no one goes, oh, I'm pining for those Vista days. And I'm not, sorry, I'm not trying to pick on anyone. I just think that, look at how cool it is. It looks really neat. It's got to work. It's got to be wonderful. I think that's the part that we need to start exploring. Just because you can construct this doesn't mean it's the right product. And I would float out this term to you. I stole this from Nassim Taleb. Taleb always talks about epistemic arrogance as the difference between what you know and what you think you know. Let's let that soak in for a second. I would riff on it further and say, product arrogance is the difference between what you think people need and what they actually need. That's kind of the new era of moving from progress, look, we got it done, to is it the right thing? How many wrong points did you have? Take a few minutes, turn to the person next to you. If you don't know them, introduce yourself and ask yourself that question that I put up there. For the last delivery, iteration, sprint, release, or whatever, how wrong were you? And how fast did you know or not know? So 5 minutes of chaos begins now. Okay, so let's see what you're talking about. Just for the record, right? I've launched a lot of Vistas. You just don't know about them. I think that like that whole 10,000 hour rule is a great idea, but you have to learn from your mistakes over the 10,000 hours. You can't just have 10,000 hours of tragedy. And the very first piece of software I got to work on, very cool, was digital audio. It was the first digital audio platform for the PC. So we were going up against what was an emergent product now called Pro Tools. And there was 3 of us, and we were all musicians, and we were absolutely certain we were going to kill it. Look at, we're all these brilliant geeks, and we're musicians. We were so irresponsible about testing. That's like a different discussion. So we go to these trade shows. I would stand at the trade show with my guitar. This guy walked up, I was in New York, I'm like pretty young at this point, and he walks up and I'm all excited to show him the feature that I fixed last night. And he walks up and he goes, it's gold, why is your product gold? I hate gold, my wife hates gold. And I was just like, dude, don't punch my child, you know? I was ready to play my guitar and give him a demo, and he just like didn't like that it was gold. And that was like one of those first sobering moments of like, whoa, these user folks, they can be tough on you. Then we went to see a guy in New York that was using our software. We didn't even know it, to produce a cartoon called Courage the Cowardly Dog. And we watched him work. And I was just absolutely blown away by what he was doing with our product. And that was sort of the beginning of me, and every chance I get, trying to have people see someone else interacting with what they do, the impact they have on someone. So in a similar vein, we worked with a company that used to be called Finale or Make Music, and they build software to help kids record music at school. So they had these personas of like boys and girls. We were like, that's not the right design target. You have to go over kids that want to practice and kids that don't want to practice. So sadly, the place is totally FUBU, you know, for us, by us. You got more musicians, again, writing a piece of software. We took them to a grade school so they could watch a grade school music teacher use their software. So a grade school music teacher has a 4-year degree, probably with an emphasis on music, probably a couple more years beyond that. This person's probably studied music, is in love with the music, and took a job teaching people that will never, ever play in tune. You know, so if there's a heaven, like that person's there. These guys walk in, they got all these great features. This teacher can't find any of those features because she's under the gun trying to kind of keep up with kids that don't necessarily want to practice. And it was a bad sample set of one local to their shop in South Minneapolis, and the programmer's empathy went up by a huge factor because they watched someone. So some of the big insurance companies I work with, the programmers are like down in a trench somewhere, the teams are, I should say, and they're like, well, we never see our users. And so we've swapped out their product retrospectives and their reviews by watching movies that people have taken out on site where people are using their product. That's their demo. They don't show people what they did, they watch people use their product. That's all about when you're getting stuff done, trying to say, is it the right thing? Because if your feature is really great and no one can find it, it doesn't matter how great it is. And that's a harder thing to automate. I'm going to show you some tools around that we've been using. So I'll show you some of the ways I'm trying to get people to embrace uncertainty. In fact, I've been trying to use language that's different. I'm notoriously bad at language other than business camping, which I should have patented, registered or whatever. But I like this idea of planning to discover and learning from delivery. Because I can't really, I remember kind of when the Scrum and the Kanban wars were sort of going on, I was just like, all I could hear is that 1970s commercial of like, you got your chocolate in my peanut butter. And I just thought, this is such a ridiculous discussion. Whose process is better? You know, it wasn't even appropriate. It was just kind of this interesting war. So I like this idea of discovery. So here's a group of people doing discovery. This is a pattern you'll see in a lot of the pictures I use. I can do this stuff electronically. It's not quite as fast. I stole a term from a friend who called this presentation a story map. His name's Jeff Patton. When Jeff gave me that term, I thought, I like that term a lot because a map connotates, I'm going to take you somewhere. And I think instead of what did we get done in Sprint 5, I think we should start saying, where do we want to take the people that are interacting with our systems? I was going to say users, but user is one of those words, it's like a zombie word. It's kind of the undead. It wanders around and we say it to each other like we all know what it means. So the way these maps are sort of oriented typically is you have some kind of interaction left to right. If it's an algorithm, it might be a flow or a set of steps. And that's very different than I think how I learned to write stories, which was we're getting jammed up trying to get the requirements right. Let's sit down with someone and use their language and try and understand. The very first person I saw write stories was from a web server, a product called Gemstone. The guy showed up. I was a tech lead. We were going to use this product. He sat in front of me and just talked to me and just typed on his computer. And while he was looking at me the whole time, it was like we were playing this game of Battleship. It was super weird. And finally I said, what are you doing? He spun his computer around, and he had just been capturing like verb-noun combinations, trying to understand all of my language, trying to kind of, doesn't make sense to him, doesn't make sense to me, he played it back to me. And so I started writing stories like that because I think it was a shift, again, from like the myth of like a complete written tradition to a blend of a written tradition and an oral tradition. The story maps sort of feel like maybe another evolution. That's not magic. So the other thing that's interesting in these maps you'll see is right here. So there's usually some idea, this is their idea. So just, this is a little fun exercise we did. This was in the Ukraine, in Kyiv. And these guys created this product called Instapee. So it's like Uber for toilets. Because if you've ever been in Europe, you're walking around, especially if you're an American, suddenly you realize, I gotta go to the bathroom, and you just assume you're gonna walk up to a restaurant. It doesn't work that way in certain parts of Europe. So you find a toilet and then you rate it when you're done. So that was their idea. You can imagine it's a pretty clever idea. I think you could do something with it. So they said, who cares about it? So there's like an idea, and then there's someone that's going to care about it. And then this is the key for me. This has been the big game changer, is I would say, if she's going to care about it, give me some examples. Right away, give me some examples. It pushes people to give you something contextual. Food for thought would be, what's the difference between an example and a test? Not much. When people get frustrated, if you're working with people, you drive them a little bit too hard, they'll say, look, for example. Next thing that comes out is usually something fairly discrete. If you're working on stories, it's a decomposition of a story or it's a specific example that you can replicate, which starts to smell a lot like a test. And I used to say, let's start with something simple and go to something hard. This would be simple, medium, this would be hard. A year ago or so, I was out here at a conference at Intel with Don Reinertson and Dave Snowden. And I thought, well, Snowden's language sort of fits better because it starts a better discussion. So now I don't typically say simple and hard. I say obvious to complex. And I think obvious to complex is a nice riff. So I'm sitting there with someone who doesn't know anything about any agile stuff, doesn't know anything about stories, and I say, you have this idea, you have this person you think cares about that idea. What's the most obvious thing they would do if they sat down in front of your awesome idea? And if no one can tell me what that is, I'm pretty sure we shouldn't start sprinting, because we'll just be going fast. Velocity, often forgotten, is speed and vector. It's going somewhere fast, not just going faster. It's supposed to have sort of a direction associated with it. So this is sort of a web app, and then there's a lot fewer, there are many fewer constraints, and what this little line that you can't really see too well right here is what we call a journey. It's a path through that map. So I was really excited when we started getting stories done early on. I felt really good about myself, and then we said, gosh, it turns out that if we actually think about what done looks like for one of those stories and we put it in the form of a test, that's better. And I saw there was a session on acceptance test-driven yesterday. So that was, I wrote one of those acceptance test-driven frameworks. Mine was sadly called the acceptance test framework. I just didn't really think about ATF when I created it. But all of us were trying to say, hey, that was a step forward. But I still feel what's lacking as a overt discussion in the Agile community is not how is one team doing getting one story done in one sprint, but what is the cost of change in testing, trying to test across stories, across sprints, and when you have multiple teams, across teams. That's sort of this hidden discussion that's not out there because we're still too focused on a story. So web app, phone app, medical instrument. Same model, same stuff that's laid out here. These are examples. This is the story map. These are user stories, and these are interactions inside the device. So it's an instrument. This is a little tiny company in northern Minnesota, Alexandria, Minnesota. It's halfway between Minneapolis and Fargo, so you haven't gone off the edge of the earth yet. And they're competing with Roche, a giant organization, because they're producing whole product faster. Now their constraints are, this is a software-only play. These guys have 3 mechanical engineers, 2 software engineers, and an electrical engineer. And what's bonding them together is what's the first path, not what will we get done in iteration 1. What's the first rev of the instrument? It might look like that through those stories. So that starts a discussion of what do we want to learn, not what can we get done. That's a step towards product over progress. Now it assumes that you're getting stuff done. Obviously, if you're not getting stuff done, this doesn't really matter. But what it does, even before you start getting things done product, is it says, what is the first thing we want to learn? That's very different than how a lot of people teach people to plan, is they have them write 100 stories and they rank order them 1 through 100. No product manager I know thinks of the world in 1 through 100. They put them in some categorization like Daniel Leviton's talking about. So the categorization I'm doing here is a left to right interaction with the product categorization instead of a big and small categorization, which is what most people are still doing. And sort of the problem with this big and small picture is you end up, people are doing the right thing. Can you see that? Yeah. They're doing the right thing. They're trying to say, this thing's too big. We'll call it an epic. And they're trying to break it down into smaller things that are doable. So that's the shift from, how big to too big. And the problem, though, that I always kind of see is that testing often goes like this. It cuts across these things left to right. User experiences are cross-cutting. And this is a good delivery metaphor. This is a better discovery metaphor. This is more product. The other one is more progress. It's a very subtle change that I think is starting to happen. This is at the National Institute of Health in DC. So thousands of people at the National Institute of Health. We are trying to not have them all transform. We're trying to go into different areas and say, how do we show evidence of success using agile methods? One group might be doing a pure science thing, where they're trying to like this, one of the groups we work with are the people that worked on our part of the Human Genome Project. So there's not right answers there. There's science. It's pure research. Then there'll be another group that's doing something that's very discrete. It's a neat place. And so what they're trying to do is catalog all the books of medicine from the United States in the last 200 years so these fragile documents start getting put in electronic format. There's not a lot of discovery there. Stick the book in the machine, turn the machine on, pump it through, make sure that the document you produced is valid. One is wildly unknown, one is much more known. And that's why I think that's more of an interesting than Agile or Scrum or Kanban or Agile or Waterfall is known versus unknown. Certain versus uncertain is kind of, I think, the more the right discussion for us to sort of be having. These guys have an even weirder problem. This is the problem they have. As one of my friends would say, there's just too many damn engineers. So it's great, right? Everybody wants to deconstruct everything. One of the places I work that has almost entirely engineers has this testing group, and one of the testing guys was in this meeting one time, and he goes, look, we just got to finish to begin with. He said it, and I was like, that's so honest, right? So these guys love breaking down problems, but they're pretty disconnected from the impact they're having on people. They're solving neat problems, and some of their problems don't directly look like they touch someone, but eventually someone is impacted by what you're doing. And so what we're trying to do is have them become maybe product engineers instead of software engineers. You know, the goal is to produce something that's significant for someone. And so I keep showing you all these examples. I'll show you sort of what it looks like in electronic format. I don't know how washed out this would be. Full disclosure, this is a product my company and Jeff Patton's company both started writing because we work in so many distributed ecosystems where you can't use Post-its. I've tried every weird thing you sort of can with Post-its, but we're trying to, there's some aspects about this that are nice. So this is a map. This is a journey through the map. That's the weird red line I was just showing you. If you walk through the tests of those stories, you would find it looks a lot like a test plan. And then you still have to understand status, so this shows what's done in that journey. So things that are more shaded are more done. But what's really cool is you're not talking about anymore about what did we get done in sprint 5. Time is a secondary measure. It doesn't show queued up, in progress, and done. And that's another one of the shifts that's throughout all these pictures that's not obvious to you, is we're shifting it from progress to product. So that's kind of, I want to riff on that a little bit more. I heard you guys took questions yesterday. I don't usually do that, but I'm always trying to get through like 45 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? I love little conferences like this because these are the best gigs to play. About 200 people in a theater like this. It's a sweet, nice sounding room. Any questions? Okay. All right, we'll roll on. So I said before that if you're not getting stuff done, it doesn't matter. I'm going to make an argument, maybe you disagree, that we have a lot of practices about getting stuff done. We have a lot of practices about visibility. We can measure progress. There's a gajillion tools. We have nice little forums for getting people connected. We're by and large starting to organize the right teams, but we're not necessarily thinking about the structures we need to get product out the door. So I used this term before. I first learned this term from the people at Xerox PARC that were doing aspect-oriented programming, and someone said cross-cutting concerns, and I was like, that really fit for me. So if you think of like anybody in here who's worked at a company of 6 or fewer people, or 10 or fewer people, yeah, how much, keep your hands up if roles mattered. Maybe a little bit, but by and large, a small group of people, or especially if they all have their money in it, are bonded around this dimension. Are we going to be profitable? Are we getting something out the door? Are we building the right thing? Then you start getting like larger programs and the weight starts happening. And you stop thinking about this so much because there is some structure that's happening. A lot of the books I've read in the last few years are about military campaigns. So that collides with business camping, I know. But the military figured out scaled agile a long time ago. In the year 2000, the Romans knew the right size for a team was 8. 2,000 years later, the Scrum people said 7 plus or minus 2. Some things we evolved faster in than others. The Romans knew that You had to have groups of people that could work together and make decisions and solve problems that were part of a larger mission. And while I'm not a fan of war and such, if you think about it again, like static and dynamic, those large-scale military events, they do a bunch of planning. Everything changes. You don't replan, you lose, whether you're the Spanish fighting the Moors or the invasion of Normandy or something. And as soon as things get bigger, I think people stop going on this dimension, because this is the dimension of like uncertainty. This is the dimension of that icky thing called the market. The market doesn't care about your continuous integration server or your story points or any of that stuff. It falls metaphorically. It pivots, it does what it wants to. Now, if you're building a medical device, you want more process. But if you're adding the weight of trying to satisfy the FDA and you don't need to, you added extra process that you don't need. And sometimes it happens when we prepend things with enterprise. Enterprise Agile was sort of like the beginning of military intelligence for me. And I get why people are doing it. They're trying to say, this thing that happened well here, we'd like to see it happen at large. I'm just not sure that's sort of the right way to go. So this is food for thought. Do your structures, these things like this says governance and governments. That doesn't just go away no matter how many times you say agile. One of the problems I see in organizations is we get a team working, we get a program working, and then we spin out to the portfolio level, and the decisions that are made are based on tax codes. And I don't think you're going to change what the IRS says because you say agile. No matter how many times you stand outside their world and scream, you have to sort of play that shell game of funding. So this would be the question for you, and I'll show you what I mean. Do your project structures feed product learning? I went into a larger organization the other day, and someone set up 40 discrete Scrum teams. It's like, I call this the Scrum times 12 solution. If Scrum is good, let's have more Scrum. Then they have product owners of product owners of product owners, and Scrum masters of Scrum masters and Scrum masters. And at some point, you can't just solve the problem by prepending words. You have to figure it out, because I think the issue here is, from a product perspective, things cut across here. So cross-cutting constraints have to do with architecture, they have to do with security, they have to do with testing, they have to do with user experiences. Kind of the thing I see happening, I'll give you that one of the companies I was talking about built a really popular product. In fact, let's just draw the picture this way. A small group of people built a really successful product. 8 to 10 people. It's a really high geek factor. The company is called Code 42. That sort of says it all. It's a product called Crash Plan. Has anybody used Crash Plan? So they were going after individuals. Out of nowhere, they landed Apple Computing as a client. They do online backup. So now they have multiple versions of their product. And this is where the discussion gets interesting from a structure versus product perspective. They have Crash Plan Android, they have Crash Plan iOS, and they have Crash Plan Web. I said to them, do you want Crash Plan to run on iOS, or do you want an iOS version of Crash Plan? And I learned that from working at companies that said, we got to make our product run on Mac. They made their product run on Mac, and none of the Mac users bought it because it wasn't a Mac product. And that's an interesting product choice that's not about how much you're getting done. So now they sort of have this central group down here. This central group is often called engine or services, or has a lot of different names. But you end up with a traditional old school like producer-consumer relationship. This is not a new picture at all, but it's trying to drive the choices you're making towards team structures and process around product instead of let's have more Scrum teams. That's kind of like let's propagate process instead of start looking at the more ambiguous thing. Like the discussion about whether you're doing Kanban or Scrum or story points or ideal time, or you call it a daily stand-up or a daily Scrum meeting, is so trivial relative to the complexity of are you building the right thing? That is so much more unknown. That progress piece needs to sort of feed that. So what happens in this situation, a lot of you probably know it, is everybody asks for similar or different things. And sort of these people down here need to kind of say to one group like, yes, no, and later. A lot of times you can't say no, but you can say later. This is actually my very first white paper was about this. This is how I got involved in this coaching stuff, is I wrote a paper because I started doing extreme programming with multiple teams, and I was like, there isn't a paradigm here that works because we have a complex multiplicity of multiple consumers and one producer. Okay? So a couple more things here. I talked about structures. I talked about like discovery. So now I want to kind of talk about like readiness. Who's read this book? Anybody in here? What'd you think of it, dude? That's exactly how I've used it too. So like my parents were both pilots when I was a kid. And one of the stories in the book is about a checklist that pilots go through before they take off. And it's a good story because just because you go through the checklist doesn't mean you can fly the plane through a storm. It's one of those things of like, the checklist helps you figure out, it helps you deal with what you know so you have more bandwidth to deal with what you don't know. I'll give you a more specific example. A lot of times when we're teaching people this agile stuff, we say, there's 6 of you, you have $3,500 in a school bus, and you have to get from San Francisco to Cancun as quickly as possible. And you gotta show up with the bus. And you gotta drive the bus. Metaphorically, the bus is your code. So what's interesting in the experiment, first of all, is all the software developers assume that everybody's gonna drive and they have to sleep on the bus. I don't know why that is. It's like somewhere in their education they learned that like life was pain. Around the world, that's what happens. They just assume that. They don't even kind of say, does everybody want to drive the bus? Maybe some people are scared of the bus. And what's interesting to me is that it's like, how much can you learn quickly about the rest of the people on that bus? What are the things that are known? So a lot of them kind of say, well, you know, what happens when we get to the border? Well, if you show up at the border in your bus and you don't have a passport, and you go, whoa, we didn't know we had to pass passports. We're an agile bus. Like, you're an ignorant bus. That's a solvable problem. That's something that's known. And that's what I think is really good in both these examples. They're talking about like what's known and what's unknown. So what I've been thinking about more is this is what I think of like the world of discovery. So you're trying to fill a backlog. Let's just use some real stock agile terms. Or you're trying to build like a product roadmap. I like that language. And this is the land of raw discovery. Over here is this place I like to call Scrumbanistan. Or Scrumbanavia or Scrumbania or something. It's the land of learning from delivery. One of the mistakes I think I made early on in XP, sorry about that, is I just said, if I sit with someone that I'm talking to and I use their words, I will be building the right thing. I was so happy that we were getting stuff done that I arrogantly stumbled through 7 projects until finally I got put with a customer, XP language, Scrum language, a product owner that was a crackpot that had no idea what was going to go on and prioritized us into not building the right thing. And we didn't find it out until too late because we waited to validate that. We were so focused on getting stuff done. So whatever tools you're using, these are the tools we use. We're trying to get people, before they rush off to start iterating, to say like, why are you doing what you're doing? Who are you doing it for? What are their needs, as best as your guess? And where are you going to start? So that journey is something I showed in that tool. It's one of those little red lines. It's like, what's the first significant thing that you can measure against that's not just about getting stuff done? And so I'll show you, here's sort of what it looks like. Now I said scaled readiness because if it's 6 people, you might be able to do that pretty fast. When it's 60 to 600, it's a little different. So this is a large program at Thomson Reuters. Has the same thing I was showing you before. This is someone they're going after. This is who. These are those examples, and they're organized from obvious to complex. The map is being built up out here. The map is pretty simple. These are like high-level activities that someone might do. This is a subset of that. This is the training course right here. So we walk through, and one of the things I think is neat about this picture, one of the reasons I use it a lot, is like this dude right here. This is not a happy camper. So you could say he's resistant. I think dude's uncomfortable. He's never done this before. He's an engineering type. He wants the world to be certain. And the world of product development is nonlinear and it's sloppy and you're wrong. You're wrong a lot. And if you're not willing to do that, you're going to be uncomfortable. So he's walking through, doing the exercise. This dude right here in the upper right-hand corner in the red shirt, he's the product manager. You can tell because he waves his hands a lot. And I'm sort of partially joking, but I really watch people a lot. That's part of what my job is. And I think someone's got to get people excited about the thing you're doing. I worked with this guy in the Netherlands for ING on an option management system at a bank. And I used to call him the Dutch cowboy because he always showed up with like chaps and motorcycle boots, and he rode a Harley and he was really into it. When he told us about options, it was like, yeah, options are exciting, because dude would like kind of get up there and tell us these stories. And then this BA guy would get up and he would tell us the stories, and he was kind of like Stephen Wright without the humor. And you could just see people fade away. And I don't think there's an agile practice called be interesting. But if someone is telling you the story, is not excited about the story, then this stuff just turns into a construction act. And if that dude can make options interesting, because options are actually quite fascinating from a time perspective, that's what I think you need. Now, this guy right here is someone that I've been thinking of as like a product, maybe a product-driven architect. He understands the constraints in the system. Hand waver dude is thinking about, here's what we could do. This dude's thinking about, here's what we can't do. Or here's what we might do. And the moment that I think is really powerful is right here. And I'm really having a hard time replicating this in a piece of software. So if you go around the world, what's happening here is two words. So they happen to be pretty constant in a lot of languages. This person is saying this, and this person is saying that. And it's really interesting. That's one of the things I've learned to do in languages, is to try and learn the words this or that. Because when people are mapping like this, right away, that pointing happens. And that's really powerful. And this is kind of connecting product with tech. And it doesn't matter to me necessarily what roles are there, is they're walking through. And design, I heard someone say once to me, Alan Cooper said, design is an exercise in constraint. So you have to start figuring out kind of what is it that you don't know. And maybe what you don't know, you don't know. So they go through, they start mapping. And so look at the difference between this picture and that first picture. I sort of feel like that's something we should go back to. That's something that when we all started using index cards, which is funny because Daniel Levitin in The Organized Mind is talking about using index cards. Doesn't know anything about this whole agile stuff, is people touched the plan. Multiple people worked together, and you grabbed a card and you moved it around, and it's just a simple kind of concept of like, when people interact, they feel engaged. It's a really hard part of the product that we're building. Now, in your world, do you remember the first time those 3 dots popped up when someone was texting you and you went, yes, she is listening to me? That was a $1.98 feature, right? They had that code, they had that data. They were thinking about what's an uncomfortable thing when people are texting, is you're wondering, is that other person reacting? Now, I'm not sure if I'm totally satisfied with that feature, because a lot of times the dots come up and they go away and nothing happens. Thinking someone did not test this well. It's bothersome to me, but that's sort of an example. So they go through, they're mapping for a while, and this is this discussion of like, how do you know when you're done? So that's a really interesting question. That, to me, is the shift from how big to too big. So I use an ugly heuristic. I would say to everyone in the room, think of a number 1 through 100. 0 through 100. 0 is, we have not expressed any of the needs of this product. 100 is, without regard to size, we've expressed everything that needs to be out there. When those numbers start popping up around 80, I feel like, okay, now it's time to go tell the story to a larger group. Let's go put it in front of the people that are going to do the work. Because this is a subset of people. Skills typically that I think you need in this room, I stole this from a guy named Marty Kegan, talks about valuable, usable, feasible. Now I've heard people replace usable with desirable, because usable is a pretty sad standard. Guess what? It works. You know, that's like, desirable is like, wow, this is really cool. I don't know what it was like for people here, but in my school, my circle of people, Uber went from a word I didn't know to a word everybody I knew was saying in about 3 weeks. And when I asked people, what do you like most about Uber? What do you guys think the number 1 response was? Easy, yep. The number 1, I thought people were going to say, oh, it's really great. I can see where the car is. The number 1 thing I heard from people is when I get to the airport, I just get to get out of the car and walk away. That was really interesting. That was the business traveler's perspective of like haggling with the dude at the credit card at O'Hare is never a pleasant experience. Because you still have dudes swiping the cards. So now this guy gets up. So this is really cool, right? This is a game changer for me. A game changer sort of like embracing test-driven or automated testing. There's a little bit of a charter. So simple thing we did. There's those same pictures I keep talking about. Those are the examples. This product manager is now walking through this map, which are little stories that are going to get fed to these teams. So you have this delivery thing connected to this discovery thing, and you can sort of figure out what you don't know faster. He's telling the story. It's not quite as simple as this, but there's multiple teams in the room. This is not 6 guys and their buddy who knows everything about the website. And he gets to the point where someone in the room says, hey, what about? I always feel like a lot of my best developer friends are what I would call whatabouts. You show them something and they're like, what about, what about, what about, what about, what about, what about? They're always exploring the options. That makes them a good programmer, a good technologist, if you will. And so now architect dude gets up and you have a really brilliant thing kind of going on where these two are doing like this product-driven systems thinking or architecture. And that I don't think is happening enough. Now, again, if you have 6 people, you don't need to worry about this. But if you have, it doesn't take 60, it doesn't even take 600. One of the guys that works at DevJam, he and his wife just had twins. I sort of feel like twins are more than twice as hard because being a parent doesn't scale linearly. It's sort of the same thing in this product space. 2 teams is more than twice as hard. 4 teams is significantly more difficult, not about the construction side, but around that structure versus delivery side. But that's still, okay, now we're ready. Another question for you is like, if this is sort of the land of sizing, and we'll just call it the demilitarized zone, and this is raw discovery, and this is Scrumbinavia over here, and you're going to bang away iteratively, and that's good, right? Because now you're switching to, 100% to 8%. An interesting question is, how much time should you spend here versus here? That starts to be a whole different discussion than in Scrum, you write all your stories in Sprint 0. I heard someone say that. I was like, that's absolutely arbitrary. That's 100% process-based thinking. It's not product-based thinking. What if I said to you, because this is the old school discussion, when this becomes 50%, it's 1996. So I would argue maybe this is some percentage. I might roll with 10% versus 90%. If things are more certain, they're more known, there's less uncertainty, shift this thing this way. And you're going to figure out what you don't know in those early iterations. But that's a more interesting discussion. And then the next part would be, like we were talking about before, what tools are you using to do that raw discovery? So sort of zoomed in on an iteration. This is what we've been teaching people. What if you thought of like a product design cadence and a product delivery cadence? So somewhere out here in iteration 5, you end up with some kind of a cadence that looks a little bit like this. So we'll just do a sort of a simple picture. And someone is trying to get ready to feed stories into an iteration. And again, I don't really care about Scrum versus Kanban because you sort of have the same problem. It's just a different way of looking at the problem. And so the checklist that you use, that's what I've tried to do too, is say, how do we know you're ready? So one of the things I see is, as people are getting ready, they start out with like, well, here's what we thought we would do. Here's the new stuff that we want to put in. But then inevitably, there's old stuff they didn't get done. And way, way back here in the past, there's the broken stuff that wasn't done right the first time. So those people are trying to vet between old stuff, new stuff, and BS. I think it'd be pretty sweet if we stopped calling them bugs. I stole this from a guy named J.B. Rainsberger who said we should just start calling them mistakes. Because then we would have meetings like, how many mistakes are there on this product? It's a much stronger dialogue. It's like, it's not right. It's either broken or we didn't do it right the first time. I think more often we just didn't do it right the first time and we euphemistically call it a bug. So those people are going from, here's what I think we should do. Now, the other side of that picture that I would draw is something that maybe sort of looks like a crescendo. And I think sort of what comes out the other side of that crescendo that we've been trying to teach people is in order to be ready, you need to have stories, good titles. Journeys are maybe a more powerful way to do that. You need some tests if you want to be ready. And you might need some UI, some visual design. So this is one of the things we've been doing with groups because this is a simpler picture. It's just one team. When this becomes one product built by multiple teams and you have multiple teams down here, if you're not ready and you haven't figured out how to disseminate product needs across delivery teams, this becomes a noise loop. And people say, I hate going to sprint planning. In fact, I heard a group, this was one of the first things I heard 6-7 years ago. We tried Scrum, it didn't work, so we went to Kanban. I was like, oh, what didn't work about it? Because I'm curious. Well, everybody hated the meetings. I was like, oh, well, why'd you hate the meetings? Because we never really knew what we were talking about, so they took a long time. So you went to Kanban. Right? Good job. Sort of ran away from the problem, and I feel like it's easier if it's one person who knows everything and 2 or 3 people down here, when it starts gets scaled up, that readiness stuff becomes really a fundamental part of like asking yourself the same way people are talking about a definition of done, what does it mean for us to be ready? Sort of like test-driven product to me. So I'm going to leave you with just a couple things to look at, to think about. I'm curious how you think about these things. This is one way to, I think, concretely measure wrongness. Some complexity. Who's using Sonar at their company? Anyone? So a couple people. To me, this helps you figure out what you don't know. Right? This shows you the things you can't necessarily see. Another thing that's really cool, I could show it to you if we have enough time, is there's a really great little visualization called 800 Days in Minecraft in 8 minutes using a tool called Gorse, and it plays back what everybody did in Minecraft across 800 days in 8 minutes, and it shows you complexity growing inside the code. This, to me, is a visualization of quality. It's a little bit too late. It's like it broke. I mean, it's better because we're not pushing it into production, but it's still like this feels sort of like what was good in XP land is we started kind of saying, don't tell people if it's done if it's not green. Start adding some tests into that. Let's automate the things we can. This is a more interesting evolution. This is what I was telling you, this is how most people have their walls set up. This is a progress view. If you have one of these walls up and you add a third column to say, is it valuable? Question mark. You'll find out that you don't feed certain things in here to do because you can't even really tell me how it's going to be valuable. If you try to say it's valuable, then you have to start measuring it. So is anybody using Mixpanel in here? How do you guys use it? So it sees what the customer is doing, helps you figure out, is your guess right? So in Cardboard, our guess is we're selling you guys not features, but collaboration, because people that are trying to do distributed design with Post-it notes don't have a tool to work inside of. And doing it in Visio or PowerPoint is pretty horrid. So the tagline for Cardboard is if Google Docs and Post-it notes had a kid, it would look like cardboard. So sort of like Google Docs, 2 people can be in it from 2 different locations. And so we think we're selling people collaboration. So upstream, we're tracking how many collaborative events there are. That's our upstream measure of impact. Our downstream measure, our lagging indicator, is how many licenses we sold. Because that's too late, right? Saying how are we doing with sales is way too late in the game. Now, many companies I know could easily put this in, but they're so worried about how much stuff they're getting done that they don't consider instrumentation as part of like a learning factor. That's another measure from progress to product. You got to put it in early. You got to get that in place. It's harder if you have an older system. So I'm going to leave you with these 2 books because I think, no pun intended, they're sort of good bookends. You can see sort of my discussion is assume you're getting stuff done. Then the next hardest question is, are you doing the right thing? And I think what's nice is these people all knew they weren't because they found out a lot of times inside large companies you don't ever get to challenge that. That's all I got. Thanks very much. I'm super bad at big endings. I don't have any ta-da. Are there any questions now? Go ahead.
So when you do the story map, you have your choice between value.
So when you're doing story mapping and you have a choice between the obvious kind of simple stuff and something that helps you discover where you might be wrong, how do you choose between going in terms of what to start with first, whether you want to learn something or whether you want to deliver value and get something working? How do you pick? How do you prioritize?
So there's a lot of stuff all kind of conflated together there. No, that's okay. That's how I ask questions too.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that we've used this term in the Agile community for a long time of like deliver value, but we say it like everybody knows what it means. And I think a lot of people say deliver value means get stuff done. Because I think deliver value assumes you can evaluate what it is. Going back to your question though, and you said simple, and then I would switch that to like obvious, what is the most essential thing to learn? sometimes in a big system with multiple teams, you have to learn how to wield the technology you're inside of. So I still think that's a challenge. I'm not saying, oh yeah, you just start packing away at story maps and all is good. So like, one of the analytics groups I'm working with right now is using Spark, and a lot of people don't know Spark, and they're using R, and a lot of people don't know R, and so there's a learning curve for that group. So we're doing kind of what people have done for years. The metaphor of sprint zero, iteration zero came from a programming joke. You pull in a couple stories, but you're trying to learn a little bit about the product in context of using the technology. If people that are doing this stuff, the technology is more known, then I would gear towards trying to learn in the product dimension, because I feel like that's the unwieldy, scary space that I'm always arrogant. I'm sure this is what someone needs.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Oop.
So you had mentioned about having a case where maybe your product owner wasn't aligned with or kind of sending you down a wrong direction. I've had experiences where the product owner had good intentions, but we found out that it wasn't really representing what the business really needed. So do you have any ideas about how to kind of learn that early in the discovery phase?
Yeah, so that was definitely one of those first humbling things for me is I was a geek programmer type. I'm sitting with teams, got all these tests. I'm sure, look at us go, we're getting stuff done. We're not as crappy as we used to be. And then I would go sit with the people that were trying to test across the stories, across iterations, and I realized we had a bunch of discrete things that worked because all of our tests were little discrete micro tests, but when you put it together, it was a piece of junk. It was a terrible experience, so I didn't even need to go out into the field to figure that out. Once I started solving that problem, I thought, well, these people over here that are writing those tests, that are trying to come up with those workflows, how much do they really know about what's going on out there? And then I started stumbling over into the land of product management. Now that's one of the things I think is interesting, is the Agile community still, and by and large, has the largest collection of multiple perspectives coming to conferences, but the product managers still go to their own conference. So we haven't sort of pulled that in because we flattened product thinking into get stuff done. So you can see how they wouldn't be engaged. So I think part of it is going over into that space and just getting them to tell stories instead of making them talk in language, agile language. A lot of those product manager hand waver dudes, if you say, give me a test, their hands just freeze. Because that's scary language for it. If you say, give me an example, you can't slow them down fast enough. That's another thing. So if you go to those people and you say, what's the most obvious thing to do? The people that are really in touch with the market will tell you. Now that still doesn't mean they're a blowhard. They're not a blowhard. But I sort of feel like that's one of the things we've solved in a pretty good way. We've got that delivery dimension down quick enough that we can figure out what we don't know faster. If your dimension is about getting the right thing done. And just one more thing. What's interesting to me is a lot of people at the end of their sprint, they bring some person in and they say, we did this, and we did this, and we did this, and we did this. And they're not showing them context of a product. They're just showing them things they got done. The person comes in to have a meal, and they're showing them a shopping list or a recipe. They're not serving something up to them. And an example would be, our team just made our car go faster, and we brought you in at the end of the sprint, and we say, look at it, it's awesome. Just take it out for a spin. And he takes out the car, and he comes back, and he's all bloodied. And we're like, what do you think of the car? And he's like, your car is crap. It has no brakes. We're like, yeah, but it goes really fast, right? Because he got in it assuming it had some brakes. I think like the closer we can get to validating or invalidating our idea with our target market, the more we can address that uncertainty. There's still a lot of people that just, they've plateaued it. We got stuff done in a sprint, and that's the end of their evolution. That's sort of a crabby thing to say. I'm not that crabby. Other questions? Yeah, well, there's a couple different things you said in there. It's like, are they to blame? I'm not sure who's to blame, but I know, like, if I just think of myself right now, I think one of the mistakes I made was getting so excited that we were getting stuff done that I stopped asking that question. But you just said something more powerful to that picture I was drawing. You said, the testers report to someone, the developers report to another person. But that's a fundamental shift that if you want to kind of live on this product dimension, you got to start slicing your teams sort of this way. You don't have to, right? The sun will not go supernova if you don't do that. But the reality is that this is the dimension that's most unpredictable. And if you're sort of aligned this way, especially with your reporting structure, then when the market changes, you have to rush to get everyone aligned in a formation that doesn't deal with those needs. That's like when when the Moors attacked the Spanish lined up on the side of the cliff, and they were all sitting there ready to fight the war, and the Moors rode up behind them and just cut them down. Because it wasn't like business as usual. They changed the game. Sorry, that's a war metaphor. To blame, I think that we were, in my experience through the 90s, was we were so bad at construction that it was so easy to celebrate when we got it done that it's maybe taken us a little bit of time to evolve to say, now we can start asking a more difficult question. Like in the big C++ systems I work in, it takes someone 3 weeks to get something done. When they get it done, you say, it's totally wrong, just roll back that code. This dude's got 3 weeks vested in it. You know, that's different than banging away with Python and Django or Ruby on Rails, where you can figure out what you don't know a lot faster. I've often thought the difference between failure and learning is the cost, either in time or your ego. You get wrapped up in that stuff. You're so proud you constructed it that it's harder to walk away from it. Sounds like a good birds of a feather session. All right, that is 9:30. So if you have any other questions, I don't have anywhere to go. Otherwise, thanks very much. Enjoy the conference.